podcast from the grassroots, connecting people and sharing ideas.
It's back with Arlene.
And this is Gowri.
Hi, this is Grace.
And we are at our second segment, which is our ABC Focus. Every Monday we will have an analysis about ASEAN or Southeast Asian in general, and this time we are going to focus on migrant workers in Southeast Asia, their plights, their issues, and who they are. So to start with, it's a big year for next year because of the ASEAN Economic Community. A lot of free movement of labor, of resources, and of course to liberalize trade in a way that is much more on a bigger scale than previously seen. And of course with international trade pact like RCEP, for example, where it involves six other countries besides Southeast Asia. One of the main country is China. So we will be seeing a lot of the workforce coming from all over Southeast Asia and also, outside of Southeast Asia, to focus on establishing a single market.
And of course, with all these different labor coming in from different countries, one thing that we really want to look at is are there enough laws, or are there any strong, valid laws to protect their rights as migrant workers, or even as foreign labor? Because when you go to a different country, it's a different story altogether. You're not really given the priority anymore, and people tend to look at you as an outsider, and this is of course the case in most of the countries in Southeast Asia as well, sadly, that we don't tend to treat migrant workers well enough.
And also, not to forget that we have AAC coming up, and the discussion about AAC is heating up towards the next year, which is 2015, because like Arlene and Gowri mentioned about the single market that ASEAN are targeting and going forward towards it, and also production base is characterized by the free flow of goods and also investment, so that will definitely impact on the employment in ASEAN region.
The thing is here is the recent estimation about how many new jobs that will be created in between 2015 and 2025 for the AEC is 14 million new jobs. So you can assume a lot of these new jobs are either skilled or unskilled. But the problem is AEC only target free movement of skilled labor across ASEAN member countries, and it doesn't really include provisions for unskilled labor migration. Its short-term impact on improving labor conditions will likely be limited. I think that is the part where the rights of migrant workers is a huge concern, and no one is really addressing it. I mean, I just give example of Thailand migrant workers. It attracts mainly from Southeast Asia, and more than 80% of these workers who migrate to Brunei come from outside the region. So you can see that a lot of the ASEAN countries depend on each other for migrant workers. I mean, just in our own shore, majority of them are from Myanmar and our neighboring countries. So if we don't protect the migrant workers, that means we don't really have any focus, a real focus on improving AEC.
And of course, we have we have certain laws, like some law to provide them with the minimum wage, and of course, like we mentioned in the morning.
You're talking about Malaysia,
yes,
right?
Yes, in Malaysia. And also, like I mentioned briefly in the morning, that the employers are not supposed to confiscate their passport and all that. But there is really no efforts to follow up to that, because you can say that okay,
and it's just in Malaysia.
Ringgit, yes,
it's just in Malaysia. What about in other countries within Southeast Asia? Do they even have a law? Do they even follow up on their own laws on this?
It seems that most countries in Southeast Asia, and I'm just giving a general picture based on Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, and a few other countries, it seems that most of these countries have something written, but it's not really being implemented, and there is no follow-up to it.
And okay, one area that is still a huge problem, I think, within unskilled laborers is the issues that are being faced by them whenever they come to our shore. I think we still remember there's a report being released by this one international NGO about laborers in Malaysia, how they face a real hardship in terms of their visa and also their passport being confiscated by the employers, and they have to work for long hours. They live in a cramped condition, and they virtually have no rights. They are being abused by police forces. In the case of Malaysia, you add more to the Rela group, which is a civilian police force. So with all this dimension of abuse for migrant workers, and it's just in Malaysia, not to include other countries which have even worse track record.
And also, it's
The
very
future-
interesting that
the future
all
is-
those events are happening. Events in terms of like how they are abused, how their visas. Sometimes, if visas if not issued, and then they are just forced to stay in a certain countries just to carry on the work, and then those issues. Some of them are not reported publicly, so not many people are aware of this happening. It just kept like secretly within the company, and it just kept there, and then they are not supposed to reveal all those issues outside. But then on the other hand, with the AEC going on, those issues really need to taken into the consideration, because we will have the orders workflow, and then more investors will coming into the certain countries. Then all those the level of a workflow will definitely increase.
And let me just give Singapore as an example here, because Singapore,
Because we love Singapore.
And it's
is
nearby.
really close to us.
Yes.
And out of their population of 5,856,000 are actually migrant workers, and they are in a lot of different sectors. They are in the domestic areas, construction, shipyard works, and also the service sectors. And of course, like I said earlier, there has been some laws that is protecting them, but at the same time, they are facing all these different problems like irregular salary payment, unsafe work environments, overworking, which is a major issue, physical, emotional, and even sexual abuse, as well as forced labor, debt bondage, and poor accommodations. And because of this, they have actually proposed a new program for all these migrant workers to actually come together and know what their rights are when they are in a different country. So they will actually be having face-to-face consultations with the authorities. They will be conducting different meetings, and they will also have legal representations on behalf of the
So
workers.
that's the difference between Singapore's legal rights towards the migrant workers compared to the rest of Southeast Asia. It's still very much law-abiding in a way, I would say. And it still has some protection, means of protection at least.
Yes, and this whole thing is, of course, to increase the awareness of the rights of migrant workers, and also to sort of drive the government to change their existing policies. So that's kind of what they're trying to achieve through this new program that they're introducing.
Mind you, it's not like ASEAN don't even focus on migrant workers, because if you go to the website of Southeast Asia or ASEAN, you will see they actually have a declaration on the protection and promotion of rights of the migrant workers. And if you look at it, you really read it, it's actually not that bad. It's quite it's quite good in a way that they really mention quite a few areas that is needed in terms of protecting the fundamental human rights and welfare, and also upholding human dignity of migrant workers. But are they doing much to really uphold the declaration? That's a totally different issue to even discuss.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because somebody did actually ask them the question, and they said that the root of all these problems is the ineffective implementations of what's already written in the declaration. Of course, to write it all down is one thing, but for someone to actually implement it and to follow through is another thing altogether. So, which is why the ASEAN member states which receive and the poorest sending member states of the migrant workers will actually have to fulfill the core international labor standards that was founded in 1998. And also apart from this, they are going to work more to promote social justice, decent work, and social protection to protect the rights of these migrant workers.
And in addition to that, there is a very specific concerns of migrant workers in areas of women, migrant, domestic, and sex workers, because throughout the ASEAN regions, those women, migrant, domestic, and sex workers, they face their own unique challenges, and because of the sex and the gender-based
sex workers are
yeah,
even high risk.
That's correct, and also the discrimination is happening, and also abuse that we cannot ignore. They have to encounter throughout the migration cycle. So this is another area of issues that the ASEAN really needs to look at.
Definitely an area. I mean, NGO in ASEAN have been very vigorous to somehow promote the rights of migrant laborers. For example, there's an ASEAN forum on migrant laborers, and if you go, if you just Google migrant laborers or migrant workers in ASEAN, you will see a lot of NGO initiative, but it's more of a civil society efforts. When it comes to the government's effort, it's quite lacking in a way.
I mean, lacking in a lot of areas. To those migrant workers, they are facing like the lack of access to safe, legal that we mentioned before, and low-cost migration schemes, the denial of labor and the social protection in the informal economy, and exploitation, abuse, and human rights violation, especially sexual and gender-based violence.
I'm going to talk about Singapore again.
Thank you, Gowri.
They actually
you love
have
Singapore so much, huh?
Yes, I do. So they actually have a Migrant Awareness Week in Singapore.
Migrant as in like migrant workers awareness week.
Yes, it's focused on the workers actually, but they call it the Migrant Awareness Week. And this was actually organized by the law school. Like you mentioned, it's always in the NGOs at the grassroots level. And the purpose of this was they included a panel, and they invited speakers to actually talk about what's going on with the migrant workers in Singapore, what are the issues that they're facing, and how to come up with a proper solution. And according to them, they're saying that there is no law exists in Singapore actually, and the state is resisting enacting the mentioned law. And there's also sometimes the case of a law existing but it's not really being enforced, and that is.
In other words, political will is also another stumbling block. If you are looking at ASEAN, majority of the decision making are through ministerial meetings.
Yes.
The problem with ministerial meeting compared to EU's with a more institutionalized way of addressing problems, legal problems, or even societal problems. In ASEAN, when it comes to the ministerial meeting, you have really good declarations, you have really good idealization of what ASEAN ought to be, but when it comes to follow-up, it's a bit weak because it's not institutionalized. Let's say, I just give example, let's say I'm the Prime Minister of Malaysia for this year, and I wanted to push forward on certain migrant labor laws and within ASEAN, and I push it to some of the ministerial meetings, but what if the next year I'm being replaced with someone else, and that someone else might think, migrant labor is not really our focus this year, maybe we want to push more on other issues within ASEAN that we think is more beneficial to Malaysia. That's the real problem here. It's not really institutionalized in a way that EU would have institutionalized. There's no follow-up because the mechanism doesn't allow it to have follow-ups. And this is a structural problem as well as a political will problem. Besides that, I think the biggest stumbling block for ASEAN Secretariat is the funding. As you all know, compared to EU, ASEAN Secretariat don't really receive that much funding. I don't have the numbers now, but from what we have seen, ASEAN Secretariat have very minimal funding. Their office is actually quite small compared to the EU, which have a very large workforce. When you have a very small workforce, you can only divide a few people on a few issues. You cannot really expand the issues to focus on more detailed sort of addressing mechanism. I think that's also another area that ASEAN needs to address. If it wants to address really important issues within ASEAN, it has to have a bigger workforce within the Secretariat.
And that makes sense because when the prime minister of a certain country decides that there are other more pressing issues, of course, when it comes to the prime minister, one of his biggest concern is in terms of economy, and usually that's the direction that most countries want to head towards. But then they fail to realize that these other pressing issues can eventually catch up with you and also affect the well-being of the country in the long run. It's probably doesn't want to focus it right now because it's a short-term thing, but eventually it will catch up and affect how the country is doing and even the reputation of the country.
I guess changing the paradigm, the mindset is really important, because you want to make the issue of migrant workers as not just the problem of migrant workers, but the problem of ASEAN. How to make it as a problem of ASEAN? By showing statistic that the more you abuse labor workers, the more you take away the labor rights of ordinary Southeast Asians, you are actually jeopardizing the opportunity or potential prospect of businesses in Southeast Asia. But how can the changing of paradigm happen? That's also another huge question that I guess civil society need to address, because you cannot just say, oh, government needs to do this, government needs to do that. It has to gel well with the reality that Southeast Asia needs businesses, it needs a robust economy. So getting the message right, putting the problems of migrant workers on the same pedestal of how it will, by addressing it, it will create more opportunity for ASEAN in terms of economic development or growth. That would be probably the way forward in a way.
And looking at Indonesia, actually, they kind of have the same problem, but it's happening in reverse, where they are not actually receiving a lot of migrant workers, but a lot of Indonesians are actually going out to work, not only in Malaysia, but all over Southeast Asia, and a lot of them...
the same with the Philippines as well.
Yes, and a lot of them are also going to the Middle East, actually. So their biggest concern is how can I protect these people while they are working somewhere else. So it's not so much about people in their country, it's people in the country actually going out.
And because of that, they have given the finger to Malaysia several times. Like, not the middle finger, I'm talking about
Right, it could be any other finger, that's fine.
The index finger is like, hey, don't treat our workers right. We can send them to Taiwan or any other, or Hong Kong or any other more developed countries. So don't think that Malaysians, you have the upper hand.
So with what's happening over here, it seems they are trying to come up with a few laws or a few efforts to actually protect the rights of Indonesians while they are overseas. And this is definitely a very good move, because if that country itself doesn't have proper laws to protect your citizens, you might as well come up with something and protect them even while they're away. And I think this is something that other countries can learn from as well, because at the end of the day, they're still citizens of your country, and it's your right to protect them first. For example, when the Indonesians come to Malaysia or Singapore or Thailand or anywhere else, they will actually be monitored by the Indonesian government to see if they are being given what they're promised, like a proper accommodation, food. They're not being overworked. They are getting their rest times, their leaves, and this kind of follow-up is really good, because even the other country knows that their government is watching them, so they will be a lot more hesitant if they want to mistreat these people that's in the country.
That's definitely the reality here. You know, ILO, International Labour Organization. So in 2010 survey they conducted for Malaysia, they found out that Malaysians generally have very little understanding, or very limited understanding on the needs of migrant workers in certain sectors and the positive contribution that they made to the local economy. I mean, mind you, KLCC, name me any other mega landmarks, the ones that Mahathir love to build. These are built not by Malaysians, they are built by foreigners, and we should appreciate them. There are over 3 million migrant workers in Malaysia that have played or are playing a vital role in the local Malaysian economy. So if we treat them right, they would definitely help us to even build better mega cities
And
for
I don't think it's
Southeast
just
Asia.
the landmarks. I think half of the houses in Malaysia right now is actually being built by migrant workers. You don't see any local workers in construction sites or even renovating houses. It's always either Indonesian or Myanmar or Nepali or somebody who is just outside from Malaysia.
They would do anything to just make sure that they can put food
So
in
they're
their
actually
kids' mouth.
playing quite an important role in this country, because
They
if they're not
do.
here, who is going to build all the houses for us?
Well, but then after all these issues we've talked about, what are the ways that we can move forward for these migrant workers? Well, I believe that reforming the labor migration policy is also very important in ASEAN regions, mainly because they have a lot of issues with the visa. So perhaps the migrant workers should be able to apply for temporary work permit upon arrival in destination countries, so they can also practice certain rules and the recruitment or policies in certain nations, what they need to do, so they can be educated in the company or organization that what they need to do, rather than the authorities take the or confiscate the visa from them and then keep the visas to them, so they it limits their traveling opportunities for them. Sometimes during holiday season they may just want to go back to their country to visit their family, but they can't do it because the authorities still hold their visas. But then by issuing the temporary work permit, it's just one of the suggestions. They can actually have a bit of more freedom to travel around, and then with the money they earn, they can actually send out to the families.
I think you mentioned earlier about how the government is trying to put measures in terms of ensuring the passport of the employees are not being confiscated by the employers. But on the larger scale, public awareness is more vital. Of course, any of you guys still watching MTV here?
No.
I'm sorry.
Well, there's this initiative that has been happening for years and years, which is really successful, is MTV Exit, where they have a campaign to highlight human trafficking and exploitation, which I think is great. MTV is finally doing something amazing.
See.
I think going back to what you mentioned about perception, that is very, very important.
Perception is
because
important.
I've personally seen parents walking by with their kids, and when their kids stop to look, point at the
Migrant workers?
particular worker, the
Oh.
parents would just say like, oh, he's just Indonesian or Nepali or whatever.
And,
And
I
it
mean,
doesn't
we
matter,
would
like-
use degrading words to describe them. Like,
Yes,
I mean,
and-
I'm sorry to say, but we shouldn't call Bangladeshi as Bangla.
Oh, alright.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
Indonesian
Because-
as Indon.
Yes, that
Yeah.
will affect the kid, and he will grow up thinking that, oh, these people don't matter in this country, and that's where it starts. Really, we have to teach the kids to respect everybody, because everyone deserves the same respect. They are working really, really hard to earn their money, to earn a livelihood, to send back to their country. So there is really no reason for us to put them down and use degrading terms, like you said.
I still remember back in university days, I have a friend. She's the lucky few Malaysian or lucky majority Malaysians who have maid. I never have maid in my life. And the way she described her maid, as if she's some kind of commodity that can be used or abused as what she thinks fits her. And I said that you shouldn't treat her the way that you think she's supposed to be. And then she'll give like 1001 reason why she's wild, she needs to be tamed, she cannot have a weekend, a Sunday weekend, because then she will just go and meet her boyfriend. Like, hey, you also have boyfriend, you also meet your boyfriend. Why can't a maid have a regular life, having meeting, I mean, because majority of the maids are quite young. I mean, if they have a relationship, just let them be. It's their private life. Why we need to be so nosy
It's
about
very
it?
interesting because it's a bit of out of topic, but we also need to look at the migrant workers, especially maid. Sometimes maids actually cause problems to family, because I used to have a maid when I was back in Sri Lanka. So it's not
Okay,
only
you're
the,
also one of the lucky
but you know,
majority,
it should be like reciprocal thing. If the maid is misbehaving, then it's probably okay if you want to curb her freedom and all. But in some cases, the maids are really just doing their job and they are still not being treated well.
And I don't like the way people describe workers who are lower than them, as in like they are some kind of commodity or some kind of animal that you need to be tamed. For me, if the maid misbehave, you just the basic thing is just to
cut her off, send her back, get someone else.
Just report to the employment agency, or you can lay down the ground rule. This is the ground rule. You do have your own freedom, and I won't be nosy about your own freedom. But at the same time, you should respect, like the boundaries between a worker and an employer.
And this was also said by the ASEAN representative who was interviewed. He said labor is not a commodity, workers are human beings, and all the member states of ASEAN must create fair opportunities for the people to work in freedom, safety, and dignity.
That's all for our ABC focus. I think we can have more. There's more to talk about this, because at the end of the day, we want to have an ASEAN or ASEAN Economic Community that really reflects a standard that is, on par of EU or even better.
Perhaps we can, break down into few sectors and for migrant workers to talk about it,
Yeah, in the future, perhaps. That's all from us. This is Arlene signing off.
This is Gowri.
This is Grace.